We wanted to bring this webinar to you to celebrate the partnership between Thomas Murray and Socura, and also to share our experiences over the last 12 months, good and bad, and try to predict what 2025 has in store for us all, and indeed what's already happened in the first few months of the year. The session is recorded. We'll send it out afterwards if you have to leave early. So in case you're not familiar, Socura is a managed detection response provider that provides many of the nation's public and private sector organizations security operations center capability. The team identifies and actively disrupts thousands of cyber attacks a year. Equally, you might never have heard of Thomas Murray. So Thomas Murray is one of the UK's best kept secrets, I think. We're traditionally known for providing about 80% of the world's largest banks with the information they need to manage post-trade risk. More recently, we've created a cyber practice that cut its teeth in crawl. We do everything from responding to some of the world's largest incidents to simulated risk. So doing the digital breaking and entering into organizations to test security controls and help people comply with regulations like NIS and DORA and so on. And we work hand in glove with Socura to help protect our clients. So we'll cover common mistakes that lead to data breaches, the most prevalent adversary tactics and techniques observed, so what to look out for, and how to achieve a proactive approach to threat detection and response. I'm Johan. I'm one of the managing directors and founders of the Thomas Murray Cyber Practice, and I'm joined by an amazing panel today. So I'd like to hand over to Jamie to introduce himself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamie Brummel, and I'm founder and CTO at Socura.
Thanks, Jamie. Over to you, Sean.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sean Lynn, and I'm the Deputy SOC Manager at Socura.
Fantastic. And over to you, James.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Great to meet you. I'm the director responsible for incident response and digital forensics within Thomas Murray.
So we're all on the hook for dealing with some interesting incidents at the very least. So Sean, the threat landscape's ever changing. As an MDR provider that has its own security operations center and defends customers across the UK, what type of threats do you see more often?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And to me, I believe that phishing is and will probably always be the most common threat that we combat on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's due to its wide-ranging radius, its efficiency in terms of how successful it can be on small or large groups of people, and also the variety of techniques that a phishing email can support. More recently, we're seeing a trend with the use of embedded QR codes and credential harvesters that utilize what we call AITM or adversary in the middle tactics. And then the general exploitation of pre-existing vulnerabilities or lull bins that are already within the estate. So the threat actor doesn't need to bring their own kit to the party, as we say. We also continue to see supply chain attacks. And in a lot of the cases, sadly, it's due to organizations simply passing that risk to the vendor. They believe that the solution or product that they use for daily operations is that vendor's, and therefore the risk ultimately lies with them. And we end up with these gaps in communication, a breakdown in policy. There's also this, shall we say, AI arms race at the moment, and that's leading to this unregulated minefield. We've got these LLMs or large language models that even the less sophisticated actors can quickly produce malicious scripts and even produce step-by-step playbooks to go alongside those scripts on how to run through an attack from start to finish. So it doesn't require a lot of sophistication or even knowledge of just general IT and the cyber industry. And I'd actually say my last opening comment would be about asset management and the organization's understanding of what their assets are, where they are, whether they're engineers that build and produce these instances. Do they follow a certain guidance on what should be on those assets, whether there's an EDR solution, whether the actual logging is enabled and going into the SIEM, and that can ultimately become a black hole of visibility to certainly a SOC team. And when an attack happens, if it happens in that area, we could be largely in the blind.
Yeah, I must admit, I agree. About 60 to 70% of the incidents we respond to, the initial foothold in the environment is assisted by somebody in an organization, whether that be normally accidentally, to be fair, rather than deliberately, but it's quite a high percentage. So James, as head of incident response at Thomas Murray, you help clients recover from fairly serious attacks. Does your view differ in any way in terms of the type of threats that you and we see and the leading cause of breaches?
No, certainly not in the first point that was made around phishing. I think it's still the easiest way to get into an organization, because we're going to target the person. The systems around, they might enable that due to misconfigurations and various issues, but it's ultimately the person behind the keyboard that somebody's trying to convince to do something. One of the things that we have seen in that, and Sean touched on it a little bit with the adversary in the middle part, is the toolkits now that exist to just enable that whole attack lifecycle, that the bar to entry now for what we might call a BEC or a business email compromise is extremely low. And the end product of that is very convincing. You look at these organizations, and in times past, you've gone, how did you fall for that? Now you're going, I can see how you fell for that. That is really convincing. It's well crafted. And you know through the research on the back end that not a lot of effort has gone into making that now. So I think that's something we've got to be aware of, that comes down to continuing effective user awareness. Some of the things that I think are informing the types of threats that we're seeing are things like hacktivism, particularly based around geopolitical, the ever-shifting geopolitical landscape that we're seeing at the moment. Organizations can become a target just because of where they are in the world. So you previously might not have thought you were going to be a target of, say, No Name 057. Because now you're based in a certain country or certain location, you may be hit. So it's really raising people's awareness that although you might think you're a small company, although you might think that your sector is not consequential, you probably will end up being a target for somebody at some point. Another trend and shift that we're seeing, and it sort of plays into some of the unique lenses that we do have with our client base, is the targeting of digital assets and exchanges. That's becoming much more prevalent now. As people become more aware, as markets become more open to adopting these technologies, threat actors are also doing the same. They're saying, okay, this is getting popular now. We need to put some energy and focus into developing specific info stealers to target things like crypto wallets, to look at the underlying technology behind them for vulnerabilities. There's also, and some of this is quite comical, but there's the nation state element where you look at states allegedly, like North Korea, implanting fake employees within an organization that they might have got through a remote video interview, and they might have used AI to get through that. And all of a sudden, you've employed someone you thought was in somewhere in the UK, and actually they're behind a keyboard somewhere in North Korea, siphoning out your company's critical data. And to round off on those points, when we're looking at the geopolitical landscape, and we're looking at how cyber adversaries and attackers are honing their craft, I think the term that's starting to come out now is hybrid warfare, where you've got states and state-sponsored groups are coming together with physical attacks, combining those with cyber attacks. And indeed, if we look just last month, Sweden at a government level actually called out both China and Russia as major proponents of this new hybrid warfare approach. and also calling out the cyber attack element of that specifically. So it's interesting times.
Yeah, I think that last bit is quite scary actually, because the threat is so unequal. So the Defense Committee a few weeks ago now, the former head of MI5 said that even though we don't believe from a UK perspective that we're at war with Russia, Russia very much firmly believes that they are at war with us, and they're engaging in disruptive behavior that causes inconvenience and discomfort to the population. So from a utility perspective, you can imagine the kind of threats that people have traditionally guarded against are physical. It's fences, alarm systems, locks, and safe management of sites and so on. If you change that to the digital world, where somebody could get into an environment and disrupt a water supply, or maybe affect the delivery of our health services, as we saw relatively recently, or disrupt the operation of a council, even waste collection, for example. It's a really unequal threat against the ability to defend against it, because the amount of resource that a nation state has is pretty significant, and the capability can be quite significant where they're really motivated to do something. So that hybrid warfare thing is quite scary, I think. But the rise of the accidental North Korean employees, slightly hilarious on one angle, because people are using artificial technology to alter their facial appearance, to speak in the right business language, to answer questions using things like generative AI and pass interviews. But in reality, they're getting into environments to extract data, to deploy ransomware, hold intellectual property to account, take advantage of intellectual property and use that for their own means, and so on and so on. So it's interesting to see how AI is helping sort of fairly sophisticated people-based attacks, but also enabling people to deploy quite unsophisticated ransomware really easily through writing it for them, effectively creating software, and then giving them the languages to be able to deploy it against clients that have never suffered those kinds of attacks before, and turning it into a proper business where the amount of ransom is so small that it tends to get paid, in the tens of thousands rather than the many millions. So, you just need to be successful a bit more often, and that's a very viable business. But Jamie, what kind of sophistication of attacks do you guys think?
A real mix, I think is probably fair to say. I wanted to sort of touch on a couple of examples around, firstly, SEO poisoning, where initial access method, obviously Sean touched on phishing earlier. SEO poisoning is an interesting one because it often takes employees, users, staff by surprise, because they're out there looking for something specifically, maybe an agreement, a contract template, something along those lines. The threat actors have previously compromised a number of sites. They've bumped themselves up the SEO rankings so that one of the first, if not the first, result for a search takes them to what looks like a forum. They download what they think is that document, they execute it, and actually it's some JavaScript and off it goes. So we've seen a few instances of this, and it's interesting in terms of kind of awareness campaigns that organizations will typically run, whereby they're saying, well, look out for these emails that come in, look out for these email misspellings, and they go into a lot of detail about, and that's great. I think that kind of awareness is important, but this method is often missed, so look out for the search results that you click on. Is it malvertising? Is it something that has been SEO poisoned so that it's getting you to download something that's going to get a foothold? So, in terms of the back-end infrastructure of those, things like GootKit, GootLoader, it is quite sophisticated. If you look, I think there was a recent report by Sophos, really got under the covers of sort of how they do that. And it's clever. It is clever. And, it fools a lot of people. And, we've had some organizations, several organizations be affected by that. So yeah, that's kind of one end of the spectrum. But generally speaking, the threat actors will go for the low hanging fruit. They'll go for the easy stuff. They'll go for the dormant accounts. They'll go for the exposed, unpatched VPN gateways, VDI boxes, those kind of things really are where we're seeing the focus. And I think generally speaking, there is a move towards edge devices. There's a move towards devices that don't have things like EDR running on them. Typically, there isn't such good logging on them. Certainly, when the NCSC was speaking at Cyber Threat recently, they were talking about their experience of seeing this happening more frequently, where telco infrastructure is being compromised. Of course, we saw that in the US, and things like firewalls, of course, we're seeing pretty much every week, being exploited in one way or another, and it gives the threat actor a great foothold into the environment, doesn't it? When you do that. So I would say, on the whole, a sophistication is quite low, simply because it doesn't need to be too high in many cases for them to actually get that initial foothold.
Yeah, we had a conversation with a very large insurance company just a couple of weeks ago, where we were looking at the kind of insurance claims that they'd had from a cyber perspective. And the question that came out of that conversation was, why aren't we seeing more sophisticated attacks? The art of the possible is there, and the conclusion we reached was exactly that. You don't need to deploy sophisticated tools and tactics and dedicated resource and time that takes, when the basic approaches are producing results. At the end of the day, it's a business, and until they exhaust the pool of available people that have those kind of basic vulnerabilities exposed, they don't then need to move up to the next level of sophistication, which is unfortunately entirely within their grasp as well. SEO poisoning is a really interesting one, though, because we've seen law firms in particular being targeted from that perspective. And you can imagine the kind of information that could be breached, M&A transactions, for example, and all the intellectual property that's submitted to a law firm in that kind of circumstance. Or maybe even something as basic as conveyancing, where people are seeking to just redirect the financial transactions as part of a mortgage payment, for example, or the settlement of a mortgage payment. And we've seen hundreds of thousands lost.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's another version of BEC, I guess, that James talked about earlier.
Yeah, an example we saw was actually a human resources employee.
Ouch. Yeah. Yeah, and that's bad news. I think going back to business email compromise, one of the most recent compromises that we saw was an intercompany financial transfer. And the adversary had been sat in the environment for about 3 months. Just watching the conversations happen until they saw an opportunity to intercept an intercompany transaction. It tended to be an employee, obviously used all the same tools as an employee would, so email, Microsoft Teams, etc. And just to convince the change to be made, and they intercepted a sum in the millions, which is quite the payday for 3 months lurking around in somebody's email account, just waiting for the opportunity. It's quite scary. So, the importance of response. We should move on to our second topic. So, Jamie, given the types of attacks that you see and the techniques being used, is speed of the essence when it comes to response?
Absolutely. Yes, for various reasons. I mean, I can think of a number of examples, but one that really sticks out is an incident that we triaged involving Citrix bleed. And so this particular one was enabling VDI takeover, essentially. So dropping in on sessions, taking over existing sessions. And of course, these gateways are kind of sat right on the perimeter, vulnerable to exploitation. So this particular example, the session that got taken over was the administrator's session. So if you can imagine, the initial access was essentially hands-on keyboard with administrative privileges. So from the first minute, you're kind of in a very difficult situation there. There's immediate ability to do lateral movement. So we're moving straight up, the attack life cycle there, the kill chain. So the ability to get in very quickly at that point, certainly, and do things like disable accounts, perform device isolation, that is imperative. And oftentimes, we have to rely on machine speed to do that. So actually having human access to consoles, of course, is great. We need that for investigation. But being involved with an organization, getting real kind of in-depth configurations, integrations with their tools, enforcement points, so we can do things like, push the account disable command, the device isolation command via API, via playbook to speed up that reaction even further is really important. We're talking about sort of time frame to go from, say, a typical, if we go back to that SEO poisoning example that I gave earlier that we were able to stop. That was around 19 minutes, I think, from the individual searching for something, then finding that result, downloading the fake agreement, which was actually a JavaScript file, to the TA attempting hands-on keyboard. So it just shows you, for that kind of example, how quickly you need to respond.
That's fantastic. We've also seen the other extreme where there's actually the head of IT that plugged in an infected laptop that he brought from home into the network environment. And because he didn't have the controls deployed on it, it didn't trigger anything until the threat actor tried to move laterally across the environment. They'd have known better, arguably.
Yeah, I'll jump in here because it's something we saw a lot of last year, last 12 months really is the lack of asset management and knowing your sort of network topology. You've got these critical production servers that are being stood up either in the cloud and if the engineers aren't following like a best practice guidebook, and part of that is to deploy EDR or certain login needs to be switched on. You've suddenly got these critical production servers that only one person knows about, and they might have opened up SSH for whatever reason, and suddenly you've got this almost backdoor that's in this black hole, like I said at the start. So I know we're talking about the importance of response, but it feels like there's a big gap in an organization's resilience and understanding of what actually is in your estate. The one thing we're seeing a lot of is when things are being stood down, you've got joiners, movers, levers with people, but what do you actually do when you remove certain assets from your estate? And do they just sit there and go dusty? But they're still on, they're still accessible, and they may not be patched. And again, it's a powder keg ready to be exploited. And we still see that. It seems like a simple thing to talk about, but it's very common still, which is worrying.
I completely agree. It's sort of the term of grey IT has also been bandied around for 2 decades probably, where employees effectively sort of bypass IT and do their own thing and plug into the network environment and it'll be fine. It sits under somebody's desk. It's fine until it isn't, I guess. Asset management's really crucial. So James, just thinking about at what point in the attack lifecycle is it normal to or normally necessary to engage incident response? And how do we augment the capabilities of Socura's security operations center?
Yeah. So I'd say ideally as early as possible. And you'd think, well, I'm bound to say that because I want to get involved and provide those services. But the reason is that the longer an organization tries to deal with what for them might be the first ever cyber attack that they've ever dealt with, the longer they try to do that by themselves, the worse it's likely to get. So calling in the right expertise, firms who've helped other organizations deal with all sorts of incidents, you're benefiting from that experience that helps reduce the time, the impact, and a lot of the negative consequences associated with an incident. Where we go hand in hand with Socura in particular is where we work with organizations to become part of their incident response plan, right? So you have a plan, you have a document, you have something that tells you, as an organization, how are you going to respond, and which external third parties do you need to bring in, which internal parties do you need to bring in, who's responsible for what, who needs to do what, when do we need to provide internal messaging, when do we need to provide external messaging. So while saying it needs to be as early as possible, it also needs to be as well coordinated and well rehearsed as possible. So looking at things, as I said, like an incident response plan, but also exercising those things with sessions like tabletop exercises to walk through different types of crisis, include all of those extra parties that I just touched on, so that hopefully the first time you walk through the processes in your plans or playbooks, it's not for real. And that the first time is you testing it, figuring out what works, figuring out what could be better, and then improving those plans so that on the day when you may have to break glass, you're more confident, you've got a better understanding of what you need to do, and everybody comes together in the right way. And that's what ultimately reduces the impact from incidents. It's a well-coordinated and rehearsed response.
Yeah, I agree. And our experience extends to thousands of incidents, and it's always awful, really, to see a client experience probably the worst day in their worst days in their working career, where their livelihoods put into jeopardy, the safety of their family, suppliers, and so on. Obviously, depend on that as well. And our job really is to engage and help manage the crisis and get them through in the best shape possible, and help preserve value. So value meaning reputation as well as monetary value. The integrity of information is confidentiality, preserving promises made to stakeholders, such as confidentiality in contracts, or maybe preserving the value of assets that they have under management, or maybe avoiding the actions of a regulator by dealing with an incident well. And I think the job of us jointly, everyone around the table, is to work with the client and pass on the benefit of our experience of many thousands of hours of dealing with a crisis. Whereas I know when I sat the other side of the desk, the number of incidents I'd see on a day-to-day basis and the severity of them wasn't generally that high. From a CISO perspective, you're only called to deal with one major incident in your life, because they really do take it out of you. I met SolarWinds CISO the other day, who unfortunately suffered a massive attack from Russia. So they targeted them because they got poisoned the supply chain, basically, and get into many sensitive environments across the world, whether that be US government or other governments across the planet, or other critical national infrastructure and even commercial organizations. And he had one hell of a battle on his hands to try and marshal the troops and direct the crisis, manage the communication with clients, keep the media at bay, and so on and so on and so on. That was a particularly bad one because they're in so many environments. But even when it's only your own clients that are affected, then it's a pretty big event to deal with if the worst happens. But I'm kind of conscious that we've mentioned the word MDR quite a bit, or the acronym MDR quite a bit, but not really said what it is. So Jamie, do you want to maybe expand on that slightly?
Yeah, absolutely. So MDR, managed detection and response. The term is sometimes or often used interchangeably with things like managed SOC as a service. But specifically, managed detection and response is all about identifying the threat early and containing it early. That's really what it is. I think, the term is often used without enough emphasis on the R, on the response element. So, having the ability to not simply notify a customer that there's something untoward happening, but actually take action on their behalf is a critical part of what MDR is. Now, of course, there are other sort of proactive elements in there, like threat hunting, which, of course, an MDR provider would also do. But actually having the authority and the pre-agreement with the customer to take action on their behalf. And by action, I mean things like isolating devices, blocking connections, terminating processes, disabling user accounts, whatever it takes really to stop an attacker achieving their objectives. That is really, I think, if I were to summarize, the most important part of what we do. We really work hard to ensure that we have those agreed response actions in place and that deep access. Now, of course, there is a level of trust required between customer and provider. When you do that, we're asking for the keys to the kingdom in many cases. We're asking for, fairly deep access into things like directory services, EDR tools, firewalls, the things that really allow their business to operate. But we tend to find it's a bit of an iterative process over time. You start off with a certain level of access, and then as the trust grows, we're given more and more access, and that allows us to really be effective in stopping those attacks. So that would be, I guess, how I would classify MDR.
That sounds good to me. And it sounds like it's something that you need to have before the incident happens. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yes. So I think having 24/7 preventative monitoring essentially in the environment is what we're talking about here. Preventative monitoring with the ability to take response. If you do that, then if something strikes at 3:00 in the morning on a Saturday and you need some action to be taken, an account to be disabled, etc., then you have that. If you think about that example I gave earlier with Citrix Bleed, where there's a vulnerability in your edge device, someone's dropped into your network with administrative credentials. If you think through that process occurring when you're not there watching it, and let's be honest, most organizations, when we speak to them, don't have the time really to watch these alerts as they come in, regardless of whether it's within their working hours or not. So if we're talking about outside of working hours and the ability to jump on very quickly, that's where services like MDR really come into play.
Yeah, I agree. Well, what happens though if somebody hasn't got it deployed and they suffer an incident?
If someone hasn't got MDR deployed?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so without MDR, an MDR service in place, it's going to be down to whatever processes and tools and capabilities they have in house. So that really does vary. We've seen different organizations react in different ways. Some have very well rehearsed processes and capable, well-funded, well-staffed security teams. Other organizations that we've come across, really often don't even have a cyber person. They'll have an IT team, a network person, a desktop person, and they're just doing sort of best effort. So it really does vary. Without someone who's specialist in the area, I would say it becomes very, very hard to detect and stop these attacks early in the life cycle in such a way that you can prevent them achieving their objectives and doing the bad things you're trying to stop them, what you don't want to do.
Yeah, it's something we see from an incident response perspective quite often, because clients that we respond to often don't have things like MDR deployed, which is why the incident happened in the first place, because they didn't have visibility of the event that was the root cause, didn't manage to stop it, and things escalated from there. And we certainly use your rapid response capability to deploy MDR tooling to support an incident response across the environment, get that visibility we need, use the big R in the MDR to respond to events as the investigation unfolds, and also use your security operations centers to watch our backs effectively while we're dealing with with an incident and conducting an investigation and managing the crisis, having that warm, fuzzy feeling that you guys have our backs and are watching the rest of the environment to make sure that nothing bad happens elsewhere is fantastic. So thank you for that. Kind of aware that we've focused on quite a lot of bad news so far in the conversation. So maybe we should move on to mitigating these risks and staying out of trouble. So we've spoken about the need for organizations to make sure that they can respond to incidents quickly. What should they also be doing to strengthen their resilience in 2025?
Yeah, so we've spoken already about this asset management, which we can call discovery exercises. Without sounding like a broken record, it is a really important thing to do. So knowing what is where, what's on it, what other assets it transacts with and their relationships, and the information and data that sort of move between them. I think another thing also is your conditional access policies. This is something that we've touched on a lot at Socura over the past few months. It's the ability to stop an attack quite early on in the chain. If you're a small business operating from a single office and you've got just one network topology, you can set up conditional access policies to say that stuff's allowed. Anything outside of that bubble is blocked at source. So straight away you've got the ability to really set a wall, if you like. If you imagine it like a castle, that office space becomes that castle, and anything outside of that it is blocked early on. Alternatively, if you're a global company and you've got offices all over the world, you can build these allowed IP lists, trusted locations, trusted countries, and you can go really deep into those. So one thing that we're sort of doing on top of all of that MDR conversation you were just having, it then becomes that fluid, continuous improvement of posture and maturity. These are buzzwords that you'll always hear. But once we've sort of got an idea of the estate, the information, the people, the processes and the tools, we then go about looking at where are the gaps, what logs are missing, what security solutions you have in-house that might be able to be plugged into the SOC, into the SIEM. And then if there's more value in sort of threat intelligence and you as an industry or you as a business, what's more targeted to you. You're not just a business with information, you're a business in the financial industry, Ministry of Defense or government. You're going to be susceptible to specific types of attacks and they follow specific playbooks. So the SOC then goes about putting more custom use cases, as we call them, into place to detect that more sophisticated or more targeted risk. So it isn't just plug in the SOC and when we see alerts we'll respond to them, and if we need to talk to you we will. There is that continuous maturity of learning from both outside in the SOC and also from the organization, and on that point, part of mitigation is that learning, is that CPD, as they say, continued development. So anything that the SOC can transition and teach the organization, as Jamie said, if they've got an IT team or a small cybersecurity team, we're constantly in touch with them. It might be sending queries to them, how to query their data in the SIEM. Threat intelligence, we've got threat alerts subscription where we send threat intelligence about CVE, 0 days, these exploitations that might be relevant to them. So as I say, it's just this continual fluid relationship. And one other thing that I think is worth mentioning, and it is quite specific but quite important, certainly for me personally, is the use of commercial VPNs and what software and applications are and are not allowed in the estate and how that's policed. We have a plethora of alerts based on people using commercial VPNs because VPNs aren't policed. So, I can say NordVPN, Surfshark, there's hundreds and hundreds of them, and you'll know they're big names. So you think they're trustworthy. And, at the end of the day, they can be. But in the business environment within your organization, if you've got one commercial VPN that you use, everything else should really be policed and sort of filtered out. Otherwise, you end up with, users logging in from locations that are anomalous because the VPN makes it look like that. And if you encounter malicious activity, that can become a bit of a needle in a haystack. Who is actually where? What are they using? The device that they're using, is that actually their device? Is it corporate and compliant? And that's the same for any software and applications. If you've got an allowed list, it makes it easier for the SOC to mitigate that risk, as we say, because anything outside of the norm is an anomaly and it's worth investigating. It just makes it a lot easier to filter out the noise. And that's one thing in the SOC, is the noise. If it's very noisy, it is very difficult to identify what's bad.
Yeah, you guys have a pretty tough job, because the vulnerabilities change, the threats change, and the business use changes all of the time. So finding that needle in the haystack is something that is probably more of an art than a science, I think, and based on huge amount of experience and knowledge. So it isn't something that can be done trivially, which is
absolutely.
why girls special, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and we're going back to what we were saying at the start. In sophistication levels, you'd be surprised how many of the old school, even as simple as Excel documents and enabling macros within Excel documents, it's that adage of, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Those things still work, and we still see it on a weekly basis. So of course, if it's going to work, then they'll continue to use it. And if they make monetary gain from it, then why not? So the sophistication level really varies. But I suppose, going full circle with our AI conversation as well, you've suddenly got these already sophisticated state actors with another string to their bow. So it is that learning for us as well, trying to see what we can do with what we've got. It is cat and mouse, essentially.
Yeah, and it very much is. And people think, James Bond, state actor, and this applies to any threat actor that wants to gain an advantage, whether this be extorting money, or finding intellectual property, or just knocking somebody off the internet and wanting to be paid. It's you don't show all of your capability if the basics are working, and because why would you expose what's potentially possible, so that we can then monitor for it and defend against it, when you could just use macros enabled in Excel, for example, which is that 1990s or the 2000s, do you reckon, that first came in? It's been around for a while. So, don't betray your tradecraft unless you really have to. But James, from an IR perspective, what have you got to add?
Yeah, so I'm going to repeat some of my points as well, but looking at rehearsing things with threat intelligence informed tabletop exercises and scenarios. So don't just do the same pre-canned set of scenarios every year. Work through something that's applicable to your industry, your sector, and the threats that you're likely to face. And we can look to various pieces of regulation that can actually help us here. So even if you don't fall under something like DORA, you can look at some of the good practices that it's calling out as an example. So threat-led penetration testing, making sure that you're testing your systems, your defenses, and your SOC providers, sorry guys, but testing them against the latest tools and techniques to make sure that you are actually up to the test, right? So we can look at what the rest of industry is doing, what the rest of government's doing, and while some regulations in the past have been perhaps seen as a hindrance, I think when we look at the regulations that are starting to come out now, that we've got more experience of dealing with threats, that we've got more experience as a collective of dealing with cyber attacks, these regulations are going to be more helpful than they are a hindrance. And I think we should look to some of those things.
Yeah, I agree. There's a reason the sports team practices, is to develop that muscle memory. And if you have a team of any sort, why wouldn't you rehearse for the worst event possible? I think it's absolutely essential. And I also have seen it as a differentiator in the effectiveness of the team responding to an incident when it happens, and their success in preserving reputation, value, and so on. I think it's a real key differentiator. Jamie, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, just building on what Sean was saying earlier about knowing the estate, Obviously that's a fundamental element if you're thinking about a sort of SecOps hierarchy of needs, kind of having that inventory, getting telemetry from everything, then everything relevant at least, in a sensible way, getting it into one place, something like a SIEM, and then building detection rules that are specific, use cases that are appropriate to the environment, building those up, having the ability to triage, and then the ability to hunt when you understand adversary behavior, adversaries that might be targeting you. So that's a very kind of generic, here's how you do SecOps type thing. But on top of that, there's a lot of poor cyber hygiene out there, things like not sticking to the principle of least privilege. I think that would go a long way, if organizations were to stick to that and don't over permission individuals or service accounts. And I think, we touched on it earlier, if an organization does experience an issue that requires them to call in yourselves, the IR partner, then, they don't already have a SOC or an MDR provider, then, we provide the ability to do rapid response in those circumstances, so we can immediately join the party, monitor the environment, and ensure that a threat actor is fully contained and evict them if we find them. So there are various things they can do, starting with a sort of the more basic principle. I say basic, but I mean some applications are hard to configure permissions for, but moving from there to ensuring, and I think it builds on James's point around preparation for when the worst should happen.
Thank you. Yeah, and then that rapid response capability is amazing, because the vast majority of SOCs across the globe haven't got that capability to immediately respond to a crisis should the worst happen, even if you're not a client. And I think that's an amazing thing to have. So whilst I just signpost that we'll move very cruelly to predictions and see if we can put our necks out and predict what's going to happen in 2025, and you guys can be a measure of our success in the longer term on whether we got that right. So I'd like to invite some questions that we can come to at the end, if there are any, whilst we talk through the predictions quickly. So Sean, do you want to go first maybe and tell us what's in store for us this year?
I think that's the best part about my job, is we've got no idea what's going to happen tomorrow.
You've got the crystal ball. Go on. Lots of industries.
I think a lot of it is going to be to do with defense evasion and actually the stuff you can't see. And scarily, with everything going on in the world, I know earlier we've touched on geopolitical landscape of the world at the moment. With everything we've spoken about, I don't think it will be long before we see a mass event, if that's the right terminology. And it all triggers from artifacts that might already be within your systems. And that's why I'm saying it is scary, because it's likely that if you haven't been breached, you will be breached very soon. It's now more a when, not if situation. Sorry for the doom and gloom, but I do think that there will be a sudden trigger point in the near future where something will happen. I mean, in the last 12 months, we've seen the likes of CrowdStrike and the effect globally that had, and they're, they're in the industry. They're the experts in that space. But, Russian activists, state-sponsored, Chinese, you spoke about North Korea. There will be things out there. There will be artifacts out there, and they may all be part of a network. And this is a personal, you might call me a conspiracy theorist. I'll put my tinfoil hat on, but I do believe at some point there will be a cyber attack that will be far-reaching. It will all be using similar or the same artifacts, as we call them, and it will have global impact, either financially, governmental of the state, as simple as taking down, card transactions, or critical infrastructure, water supply chain. How much chlorine is added to the water at the plants before it's sent into supply? These are all things, we're talking about smart homes now with smart meters. There's sensors everywhere. On all the new build estates, you've got smart technology. How much do I trust the security on that has been thought about in the first instance? I don't at all. And that's where I think that these sort of certainly national infrastructure level attacks we'll see something big in the near future. Sorry, but I do believe that will happen, unfortunately.
I don't disagree. Unfortunately, I wish I could. James, how about you?
So I think mine's going to be a continuation of a trend that we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, which is the reduction in the gap between a vulnerability being discovered and successful exploitation. And I think AI, we band it around a lot, but I think that's going to have a lot to do with it in first discovering vulnerability, so turbocharging that process. And then to how do you come up with something that can actually exploit those vulnerabilities? And we've seen that already. But I think that's going to continue to happen. And that's going to mean that we're able to, well, not we, but the bad guys are able to put exploits in the hands of relatively unskilled people. And that could lead actually to unintended consequences. That, they might think that I'm going to break into a certain system, and what they do is perhaps cause some unintended outage that has that systemic effect. But I think in general, exploitation and vulnerability, and we talk about 0 days, etc. I think we'll see more of it, and we'll see more rapid exploitation of that. And it's not just going to be governments and state-sponsored actors, but it's going to be anybody who can almost get on ChatGPT now and can give it some sensible prompts and has just a basic understanding of how computers and systems and networks work. That's a dangerous combination. And I think we're going to see that come to fruition over the next 12 to 18 months. And that'll mean more organizations as a result become potential targets.
I'm constantly amazed by the creativity that people have to use the basic tools that they have in front of them to cause a negative effect, basically. Jamie, what do you think?
I'm going to go back to my earlier point and continue to bang the same drum that the NCSC were banging around sort of continued move towards compromise of less well-monitored devices. And this is going to be a huge problem, I think, for the industry, or for everyone really this year. And I think it's down to the fact that sort of EDR, EPP tools are actually very effective these days. They're hard to bypass. They're forcing threat actors to the edge, to firewalls, to routers, to anything that runs compute really, but doesn't run any kind of security software on it. We're going to see a lot more of those being compromised and used as kind of jump boxes to get into other environments, to perform attacks, to form botnets. A lot of the underlying operating systems on these devices, it's kind of hard to spot compromise. The logging isn't always great. Certainly in the case, I'm going to go back to that Citrix bleed issue. There was no log generated when that VDI gateway was compromised at all, let alone the ability to send it somewhere. So not only that, what's also interesting, and another point the NCSC made, was that once these devices are compromised, it's quite a specialist skill to do digital forensics on, X brand firewall. I'm not going to pick on anyone, Fortinet, but Avanti. So
No comment.
No, it's those skills are quite few and far between. So actually, once they've been compromised, understanding what happened is made difficult too. So unfortunately, I think we are sort of victims of our own success in the endpoint protection world, and we're forcing the TAs to be more creative, to move to firewalls, hypervisors, other devices that we are yet to protect as well.
Yeah, when it comes to extracting data from hardware devices that don't have natural means to do so, that is a very slow job involving some fairly low-level skills. Absolutely agreed. I think for mine is the rise of hacktivism and hybrid warfare, so one and the same to an extent, will continue. So people taking adverse positions against, for example, supporters of the mission in Ukraine against the Russian government we've been able to predict attacks with a good degree of accuracy. 2 days later, after an event happening, we see somebody being attacked as a result of it. That's really not great. And we've seen civilian lives disrupted as a result of that. So denial of service against banks, for example, meaning that the financial infrastructure isn't available. And then chaining all of that together to attack daily lives in a particular country. So attacking the utilities that we rely on, the entertainment, the means of travel, even the means of keeping those things safe. So CCTV systems, access control systems, and so on and so on. It was really quite pervasive. So if nothing else, please watch your backs, get some good monitoring in place, and be ready to use the big R in the response, I guess, that would be my parting thought. But with that in mind, I'd love to thank today's panel. I really appreciate the conversation that we've had. I hope it's been useful to people. We've been let off lightly from any questions, so I think we've done a good job. But thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day. Take care.